Recording in progress.
It's ridiculously loud. All right. Oh, wait, nope, I don't want all of that of me. That's a lot. That was a lot of me. Okay, so no, that's different class. It didn't download. All right, let me try it again. That we just like lived through. Yeah. Talking about like Trump. Yeah. It is sort of weird to be like, well, we literally just went through that. Like it's talking about COVID and everything. It's very, very current, which is nice. Yeah, right. They try to put a new book out like every 3 years to stay like topical. So
It feels weird reading about something that happened less than a year ago instead of like normal history or books where stuff happened like at least 100 years ago.
Right. Okay, I need to figure out, no, that's not what I want to do. Okay, hold on. I need to share the screen. I know that's a lot of me. Share sound, optimize video. Okay. Is it working now? That's not quite what I want. Okay, there we go. All right. And then, okay. All right, good. So this is what people see at home. So, all right, so let's get kicked off with the presidency. So we've talked about presidents off and on the whole course, right? So some of this should be old hat, should sound familiar. A lot of it should be stuff that you're already comfortable with. So during the coronavirus pandemic that we are still living through, President Trump took several actions to mobilize the government to respond to the virus. One was invoking the Defense Production Act overseen by Peter Navarro, which allowed the government to block exports of masks and other personal protective equipment to try and keep it here for U.S. use. Healthcare workers across the country experiencing a shortage of protective equipment urged the president to use the power of the Defense Production Act to force private companies to manufacture more of what was needed at the height of the crisis. So, and those are little sort of executive actions. That's a perfect example of the sort of things that the president can move quicker on than Congress, right? Because, you know, the phrase "it takes an act of Congress" exists for a reason. I mean, you guys saw that in the Congress chapter. It takes a lot to go through to get a bill done. You know, we've seen that through the, you know, I'm just a bill, you know, that video that I sent you guys, whenever that was, several weeks ago. It takes a very long time for Congress to be able to get things enacted. And you want that, right? You don't want them jumping the gun and passing legislation on a whim and then having issues later that you wish they had taken more time on. So, so that's part of the reason why they're set up very differently than the president. But that's why with the Articles of Confederation, we realized we needed a president because we didn't have someone who could take swift action when it was necessary. So Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the president, which we've discussed before, and it's labeled the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. So, you know, they were obviously very concerned with the idea of a king, so they implemented all of the checks and balances to make sure that that sort of thing didn't happen. So the president's oath of office gives them certain duties to protect and defend the Constitution by various means, you know, through things like executive actions. So there are 3 different types of powers that the president has: expressed, implied, and delegated powers based on the Constitution. So there are expressed powers that are very laid out to the letter in the Constitution. And then there are others that are implied based on other things that are in the Constitution and then delegated by Congress to the executive branch. And then there's something called inherent powers that we'll talk about. That's not something listed in Article 2, but it's something that has been assumed at different times based on what the president felt was a need. And there's been conflict about that, and we'll talk about that some. So Abraham Lincoln, pictured here, like other presidents, cited the presidential oath of office as providing the president the authority to take all necessary actions to protect the nation. Fun fact, a lot of people assume that when elected officials take an oath of office that it's always like on a Bible, but it can be on any document that you want. So like you can actually like swear an oath of office with a copy of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or whatever. And it doesn't have to be like a traditional like Christian Bible either. It can be any religious document, but it doesn't have to be a religious document. And a lot of people don't realize that. It's generally done on a religious book, but doesn't have to be. So I find that interesting. I find it really interesting that it's not an automatic given for them to do it on the Constitution, because that's what they're swearing to protect and defend, right? To me, that would be like the most logical thing to lay your hand on, which why do we have to do it like that? Because you're swearing an oath, but it doesn't have to be. It's just what we do. So little fun side fact. So. All right, so your book discusses the different sort of powers that the president has. The first and foremost are express powers, and that's listed on page 336. So there are 5 different express powers: military, judicial, diplomatic, executive, and legislative. So for the military power, Article 2, Section 2 says, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. That's when you talk about like your National Guard and things like that. Obviously, they only mentioned Army and Navy. There was no Air Force. There was no Coast Guard. There was no the Marine Corps. What? Oh, hi, Sydney. So that's why obviously only the Army and Navy were listed, but that obviously moves forward as we have like other branches of military. I'm sure Space Force actually counts with that. Anybody else have mixed feelings about that name? It's a legit thing. We have a Space Force now. So it was basically, I mean, like NASA and all of that kind of like fell under that, but I'm mixed. It just sounds silly. I mean, okay, Air Force in the air, space is, I guess you could consider it an extension of that. But yeah, it feels, I don't know. Can we have just like left it as is? Like there was already like a logo and a thing for like space exploration and all that. But nobody asked me these things, so I don't know. Fun fact, there is also a TV show called Space Force that Steve Carell stars in, and it's basically making fun of Space Force. And the TV show copyrighted the name before the United States government could, because the government under President Trump tried to get them to either change the name of the show or not be on air at all, but they had copyrighted it first. So there's nothing they could do about it. It's a brilliantly weird little show. There's only been, I think, like 1 season of it so far. Steve Carell's in it. Lisa Kudrow from Friends is in it. There are a lot of people. It's interesting. Just look up like Space Force on like Netflix. If you like Steve Carell, you'll like it. So yeah. Just beat him to the punch. So but anyway, so we have a Space Force. So that is something like he or she would be considered to be commander of chief in chief. My tongue is not working. Commander in chief, just like with the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force, etc. So any sort of extension that builds off of that, they would be the commander of as well. So then Article 2, Section 2 also talks about judicial powers, where they can grant pardons for different offenses against the United States, except impeachment. So, so they can't grant pardons like if their buddy who is a governor or vice president or whatever was impeached, they can't grant a pardon for that. Or for themselves if they were impeached, like we recently experienced. But for pretty much anything else that's an act against the United States for whatever reason, they can grant pardons. And every president does that near the end of their term when they're kind of on their way out. They do so many pardons, and for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's people they know, sometimes it's for low-level offenses where it's like, man, this shouldn't have even been a thing. This was like overreach. So there are a lot of different reasons why people choose to do that. Then number 3, diplomatic, also under section 2, it says by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, the president can make treaties. And they can receive ambassadors and other public ministers from other countries to the United States as like guests to, you know, talk about diplomacy and negotiate things between countries and that sort of thing. So so that's the diplomatic arm, which we'll talk about a lot when we talk about foreign policy next week. The executive portion of his or her express powers falls under section 3, which authorizes the president to see that all laws are faithfully executed. Section 2 gives the power to appoint, remove, and supervise all executive officers and to appoint all federal judges. But the Constitution doesn't actually give the president direct power to make law, only to enforce and execute law that's been created by Congress. But there are workarounds, which we'll be talking about. And then legislative gives the president the power to participate authoritatively in the legislative process. So while it doesn't directly give them the right, when you start talking about vetoes and executive orders and those sort of things, that covers the legislative authority part of the Constitution. So basically they can, the president controls all of the defense sector, right? Like we just talked about with the commander in chief. So they head all intelligence networks, the CIA, whoever else, FBI, Security Council, NSA, that sort of thing. They can deploy troops domestically in the case of an emergency. That's when they can activate National Guard members. Say there's a hurricane over in New Orleans, they can like send troops to try and help with that. Or a massive like tornado hits somewhere in Alabama and destroys an area, and they can activate the National Guard to go and help with those situations. We obviously saw a lot of that after Hurricane Michael here. There were definitely troops on the ground to try and help, one, make sure law and order maintained and that things didn't go haywire, and to help in just whatever ways were needed at the time. So it's usually at the request of like a state representative, either the governor or a state senator or House of Representative member saying, hey, listen, we need you to declare an emergency and we need troops on the ground. If you guys remember, there was a small delay after Hurricane Michael before we actually had that happen. And we also had a big delay in like budgetary issues. A lot of people had to continue to go to Tallahassee and to DC and say, hey, like we really need help here. And it was actually a really large problem because that year was the year of like all kinds of natural disasters, right? We had all these fires in California. There were hurricanes that kept tearing up like Puerto Rico and all of that. I mean, it was a heavy year for just all kinds of damage, and we just got missed. So
and then I think there was the government shutdown after that.
Yeah, that seems to happen every Thursday, it seems like, right? Like, all right, we're gonna shut down. We'll see you guys on Monday. So that tends to happen every time a budget comes up anymore, and it's ridiculous, but it's almost always a bluff. Usually there's a deal met at the 11th hour, but sometimes that's not the case. So it's definitely also at the president's discretion. The president can deploy troops if they consider it necessary, or to protect civil rights. If we saw that during the civil rights movement when segregation was ending, National Guard members were activated to protect people as they were going into integrated schools for the first time, and to prevent a lot of problems that could basically take place. So one of the president's responsibilities is the maintenance of public order in times of crisis, right? Like that's that whole jump really quickly, make quick, decisive decisions when necessary. In 1951, President Eisenhower used this to justify sending troops to Little Rock to enforce racial integration of public schools. During the coronavirus crisis of 2020, President Trump sent the USNS Mercy, a Navy hospital ship, to LA to treat patients suffering from COVID as hospitals became overwhelmed. And that was a really big news story if you guys were kind of paying attention. Yes.
Since the president is like the head of the Air Force or whatever,
I'm sure the president doesn't pay for a lot of things like while they're president or even after, right? Because it's such a big deal when you see like the president walking into your shop, whatever you want, like here you go, you know. So I'm sure a lot of people offer discounts or whatever to the president, but I don't know if they get a military discount because even though they're commander in chief of the military, they're not technically a service member, right? Like, so that's tricky. But like Bush, like second Bush was in the Guard, so he would have gotten a military discount. So I don't know. So I guess it depends on whether or not they serve. Like Trump didn't serve, Obama, Clinton, like a lot of our modern presidents have not served. I don't think Carter did either, right? Or Reagan. Did Reagan serve? I don't think so. Aside from Bush, we haven't had a lot of active service members or former military in quite a long time. So that's an interesting question. Like if they pull out their ID, I'm the commander in chief. Can I get a military discount? And I'm old. Can I get a senior and military discount? You know, like I'm over 65. Can I please? I don't know. They make 400 grand a year. They're probably okay. 400 grand a year to be president, but they also don't get a day off. Even if they go to like Camp David or wherever, there's meetings, there's things. Like they literally work every single day for 4 or 8 years. So ain't nobody got time for that. Yeah. That also looks bad because like the media would spin that, oh, like you too cheap to pay like the full $2.19 for your 20-ounce Coke. Like you needed discount. Yeah, exactly. Like go into like the little local bookstore and be like, can I get this discounted? There's some tears on the pages. Exactly. So yeah, that's probably very true. So so for example, you know, Richard Nixon was he wasn't completely removed from office. He was impeached by the House, but he resigned because all the writing was on the wall that he was going to be impeached by the Senate across the board. So he was only impeached by the House of Representatives like Trump was, but it didn't get all the way to the Senate. And then President Ford, who was his vice president, stepped in and then did end up pardoning him because the impeachment didn't like go all the way through. So like if he had been impeached by the Senate, then that wouldn't have been able to have happened. And like formally removed, but he resigned before that could happen. So, and you know, it's interesting because a lot of people, you know, Nixon is obviously the butt of a lot of jokes, politically speaking. But really, if you look at like his track record, you know, so he was with the Republican Party. Your book talks about that. That's how he ended up winning the election, and it flipped like 36 years of Democratic rule. Before that, the Republicans had about 36 years of rule as well. He was actually very, very moderate, and he'd be considered doggone near liberal by today's standards. He actually created the Environmental Protection Agency. And so there were a lot of things that he did that were considered pretty progressive at the time. And a lot of historians and medical professionals who have looked at sort of his behavior through the progression of his term in office, a lot of people feel like he actually probably had some sort of like mental disability of sorts, maybe some sort of paranoid, not necessarily schizophrenia, but some, you know, maybe bipolar disorder or something along those lines that caused him to be very, very, very paranoid. And that's kind of what led to a lot of the things like him, you know, wiretapping and recording everything. You know, there are still people who are on government staff who are still going through recordings and transcribing and getting all of the things that he recorded, because he recorded everything. Every conversation in the White House was recorded, anything and everything was recorded. So they are actually still kind of rifling through all of that. Taxpayer dollars at work, people. So, but what are you gonna do? So, anyways, a lot of people feel like that was probably just something that was just missed, you know, and so that was probably what led to his downfall, unfortunately. President Andrew Johnson also gave amnesty to all Southerners after the Civil War. Wah, wah. And part of that is because it was to put aside, to try and move forward as a nation together, because they basically committed treason, right? Because they were trying to secede from the Union. So they committed treason in their actions in the Civil War and trying to break away. And so President Johnson was like, you know what, we need to move forward and heal together as a nation. And the only way we're going to do that is to try and put this behind us as best we can. And so that's why he provided amnesty to everyone who basically was on the Confederacy side of the war. And then President Trump pardoned former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who did a lot of shady things, is a nice way to put it, I think. So a lot of shady things. So your book says that Arpaio was found guilty of criminal contempt for ignoring a court order that directed his office to halt illegal racial profiling practices. There had been like a huge court case about it. Like, he always directed all of his sheriff's deputies to pull over and racially discriminate and like go after minorities and ticket them and harass them to the point where there were like lawsuits. And he was actually found guilty for those actions, and Trump pardoned him for it. So the pardon was criticized because Trump did not first consult with the Justice Department Office of Pardons, which is usually the standard practice where the president gets the opinion of that office to see whether or not it's a good idea to do. Because he was a political supporter of Trump, and because the pardon was issued before he had actually been formally sentenced. Yes.
So I'm not familiarized with the story of Joe
Arpaio. Yeah, that's what I literally just finished saying. So on page 338, the first paragraph also says it. So, so that was his choice. It was unpopular. But he did not care, because he was like, well, I'm out the door anyways, like I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do, right? And because he, he still talks about like a political, future possibly down the road, which he can technically do because he was not impeached all the way through the Senate. Whether he should is a different sort of conversation, but technically he can. So anyways, so because of that, like he wanted to keep like his political allies, right? Like you want to keep your friends close, enemies closer. So, so he pardoned him. I think everybody would agree that President Trump was somebody who kind of marched to the beat of his own drum and went with his gut, and there wasn't a lot of consulting with him, right? He was a strong-willed individual, and he'll tell you that. He's the first one to say that he's strong-willed and goes in and does the thing, and so he did the thing. So so those are some of the more famous examples of pardons that have been done that were also maybe controversial in our history. So the president is also the head of state, right? We all know that, and so they focus on diplomacy matters. So we know that we need like a head of state, like a figurehead to be able to represent our country with other countries. We found that we did not have an effective way to do that under the Articles of Confederation. So the president sort of took care of that situation. So the president can make treaties with other nations, but has to consult with the Senate. They can't just say, okay, I'm going to do this thing with this country. Like they have to talk to the Senate first and sort of get their not complete permission, but kind of they can recognize other countries as being like legitimate entities. Like if people break away, like say Texas broke away from the United States and started their own thing, like for our purposes within the United States, like only the president could recognize them as a legitimate new country of their own accord. Probably wouldn't, but that's just an example of like what could be done. Or if, North and South Korea ever, that's probably never going to happen. But if they ever kumbaya together and like get rid of the North and the South, then that becomes kind of like a new unified situation. And so that would be something for the president to acknowledge as a legitimate new country on the globe. So they can do what are known as executive agreements, which is an agreement made between the president and another country that has the force of a treaty, but does not require Senate's advice and consent. So that's the workaround, right? And that happens sometimes, like if the Senate is not in the majority of favor along with the president, right? Like if it's Republican president, Democrat Senate, or vice versa, sometimes they may take matters into their own hands to do that as a workaround. Courts have held that executive agreements have the force of law, although as though they were formal treaties. So as head of state, the president is America's chief representative in dealings with other countries. Here, President Trump meets with North Korea's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, in 2018 to discuss nuclear disarmament on the Korean Peninsula, which they're always discussing, right? Like every time we meet up with North Korea, we're like, so about those nukes. And they're like, what about them? What about your nukes? And it's always like, oh yeah, everybody's gonna disarm and disband, and nobody does it. So, but it looks good for the cameras. So I don't know that that's ever gonna happen. I know that sounds very glass half empty, but North Korea doesn't play. So to say it, lightly. So let's see, we talked about Section 3 and making sure that the president backs the laws and makes sure that they are actually followed through on. We talked about this already. Executive privilege is a claim that confidential communications between a president and close advisors should not be revealed without the consent of the president. So this is what President Nixon used as his reasoning for wiretapping and being able to do that was something that he was protected for based on executive privilege. So presidents have made this claim ever since George Washington refused a request from the House of Representatives to deliver documents concerning negotiations of an important treaty. Washington successfully refused on the grounds that the House was not constitutionally part of the treaty-making process, which they're not, it's the Senate. And second, diplomatic negotiations required secrecy, which to an extent is true because all those negotiations can fall apart if there are too many cooks in the kitchen. So a lot of presidents have claimed this, but the concept was not actually tested until the Watergate scandal in the early 1970s. So when Nixon refused congressional demands that he turn over secret White House tapes that congressional investigators suspected would establish his involvement in illegal activities. In the United States v. Nixon, the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes. He complied with the order and was eventually forced to resign as a result. This case basically recognized the first time that the legal validity, one, of executive privilege, but noting that it was not all encompassing and not absolute, and that there are limits, just like with everything else. So So that was that's part of the reason why that's such a big deal. It's the first time that they the other branches really pushed back against the president and said, no, you went too far. So the legislative process, they are required constitutionally to address Congress every year. So that's where we get the State of the Union. Now, used to, it was, like a letter, and then, like here, let's just all go meet in the building and have a thing. And now, obviously, we know it's televised, and it's basically the opportunity for the president to set forth the standards and the goals that the president wants to see achieved in the next calendar year. So that's when they lay out the things that their administration will be working on, that they hope to see Congress back them up on to help make happen. It's sort of like listing your wish list to Santa, right? Like, please, I would like, a Red Ryder, like I would like, the newest Barbie doll. Like that's the kind of concept, right? Where they're saying, here's what we're going to be working on, and we would really like your support on it. It sets the policy agenda and the budget as well, not just like, here's what we plan on working on, but the budget to do those things as well as already established projects. So, so that's why we have that. It's not just something that interrupts your nightly programming every year. It's something that is constitutionally required. Now, not necessarily to televise, but that has become the trend since TV. So there are two different types of actions that the president can take if they do not want to pass legislation that Congress has put forth for the president to sign. The first is a veto, which is the president's constitutional power to turn down acts of Congress. A presidential veto may be overridden by a 2/3 vote of each house of Congress. And then there's also a pocket veto where he basically ignores it, where he just sort of like puts it under a stack of papers and goes home for the day, right? But that only happens in the last 10 days of a legislative session. So a lot of times you'll see Congress try and push something through at the 11th hour, and it's up to the president as to whether or not to do like an open veto, and then it goes back to Congress, and then they can vote and override with a 2/3 majority, or he can pocket veto, which is just ignore it. And then they have to start the whole process over when the legislative session starts back over. So it's easier than them having to then vote on it and then trying to override it and all of that. He can just kind of be like, what legislative piece? I didn't see anything on my desk. So, so those are the two different items. So this figure breaks down the veto process. Bill passes Congress, goes to the president, then it's reviewed by all of his key people. If there's no action taken, then the bill dies. That's the pocket veto. If it's during the working days, like not at the end of the session, it automatically becomes law if the president doesn't veto it. Like, okay, yeah, I'm cool with that. Go for it. If it's acceptable to the president signs. There's a ceremony. There's a thing. He's got like 20 different pins that he signs like one letter of his name for, and then hands out those pins, and then they become worth a lot of money. Look it up on eBay, I'm telling you. So then it becomes law. If it's vetoed and then goes back for like review, and then vetoed again, like it goes to Congress, and then Congress can override it. So that has happened a lot over the years, and you can always see when the president and Congress are not getting along by the amount of vetoes and then the amount of overrides that occur. You can see, oh yeah, they really hated each other. They were like shooting down everything that they wanted to do. So anyway, so that's all the express powers that the president can do. And so these vetoes fall under that legislative power we were talking about. So then there are implied powers. So that's powers derived from the necessary and proper clause that Congress has under Article 1, Section 8, where it says powers not specifically expressed but implied through the expansive interpretation of delegated powers. So things that the Supreme Court has said, hey, based on this, this, and this, just like how we got to the right to privacy, same concept, right? And then delegated powers where Congress says, hey, the president needs to handle this particular matter. So, so those are the other two issues. So inherent powers are, did I skip over it? No, I did not. Okay. Inherent powers are claimed by a president that are not expressed in the Constitution, but are inferred from it. And all the presidents have really, like, you know, they've definitely done it. The New Deal was done sort of under that inherent power. A lot of the action that happened after 9/11 was sort of that executive privilege and that inherent power to take swift action for things. FDR did it during World War II, President Truman during the Korean War, both Bushes and the Gulf and Middle East wars all claimed inherent powers. Obama did it as well during the airstrikes with Libya. So it's definitely something that happens on a regular basis. Your book has several different examples of that. Presidents have generally ignored Congress's pushback on that. Remember, we talked before about how technically Congress is the only person or only group that can declare war, but the president says, well, I'm gonna do it anyway. So Congress actually put a provision in place called the War Powers Resolution saying, hey, you need to remember that we're the ones who declare war. And the president's like, how are you gonna stop me? Because I am in charge of them. You're in charge of the budget. So, and like we talked before, you know, so the resolution says that forces have to be withdrawn within 60 days in the absence of congressional authorization. That has also not happened. It's been kind of largely ignored. So, so the term cabinet, like you'll hear that on the news where people talk about the president's cabinet. Fun fact, that actually came from the fact that at the beginning, when the president's secretary would keep things organized for different departments, it was in a filing cabinet. So we're not as creative as we would like to think. So that's where the term cabinet comes from. Like there was a file for, you know, the defense and, you know, treasury and whatever, just in a filing cabinet. So that's why it's called the cabinet. So that's your secretaries and chief administrators of the different federal government departments, basically. So there's no constitutional status. There's nothing saying that we have to have those positions, but it's something that has been deemed necessary over the years, that we've realized, okay, we need these departments to handle a lot of issues. And the Constitution says, you know, based on that implied necessary and proper clause, you do what you got to do to get the job done. So these positions help to get the job done to protect and defend the Constitution. So they meet, but there's not really decisions as a group. There's a lot of recommendations to the president, a lot of like, here's our expertise and here's what we think. And then the president makes final calls. And then we have a lot of different independent agencies. So this figure helps break that down quite a bit for you guys. I'm not going to read all of this to you, and you're not going to have to necessarily have it all memorized. But this kind of shows you a breakdown. So this is the executive branch. So people think the presidency, they think just the president, but it's not that simple. So obviously the president surrounds themselves with a lot of analysts and advisors, the top of the top in their fields, to help give the information that's needed for them to be successful during their administration, right? So a lot of times they'll have like special assistant to the president for whatever task. You know, they'll have scientists and medical professionals and whatever on hand. Like Dr. Fauci, he's an advisor to the president, right? He's more than that. He has like an official somewhat title too, but he is an advisor to the president for certain matters. So it helps the president because no one person is an expert on everything, right? So that's when you need people around you who are, so you can get the best advice possible to make the best decision possible. So, and the staff is appointed directly by the president without Senate approval. It's who he needs. They serve at the pleasure of the president. And that means like, if they're done with you. So a lot of times you see press secretaries come and go because it's no longer the pleasure of the president for them to be doing that job. So we also have the executive office of the president, which is permanent agencies that perform management tasks for the president. It includes things like economic advisors, management and budget. They prepare like the national budget, foreign policy councils, that kind of thing. The vice president is sort of in a conundrum because there was never really a game plan for the vice president. It's literally only, the position technically only exists in case the president can no longer be president. And so each president sort of shapes what they want out of that vice president position. And for some, it's just a figurehead. For some, it's to deal with the jobs that they don't want to do. For some, it's more of a partnership, and it all depends on that relationship. So initially, at the founding of our country, the vice president was whoever lost in the general election, which makes zero sense, right? Because you've been smack talking during the campaign trail, you've been talking about each other's mama. Now you're supposed to work together to run the country. Like whoever got the most votes, president. Second most votes, vice president. That's stupid.
Sounds like something that happened between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, well, it happened for quite a while, and then they realized, well, this isn't effective. I mean, it kind of makes sense because then you're giving like the rest of the population who like the other guy like a voice, but are you really? Because all they're going to do is pick her. So then that got shifted to the system we have now, where they choose a running mate and they run with them. So the vice president is to succeed the president in death, or if they resign or become incapacitated, they become ill, something like that. They have to have surgery and they're under anesthesia. Technically, the vice president is like next in charge during that time. And they preside over the Senate and cast a tie-breaking vote when necessary, which I mentioned sometime in the last few weeks. And then everything else is dependent on the relationship that the president and vice president have together. So it definitely helps them win an election, right? Like they choose a strong candidate who has more experience. Like Obama and Biden worked well together because Obama was younger, fresh face, didn't have as many years of experience. Biden was an institution in the political game. So he brought a lot of that experience to the table, made a lot of people more comfortable with him as a candidate because it's like, okay, he's got somebody in there that's been doing it a while. He knows the game. Like, we don't have to worry about just this fresh-faced kid, like messing things up. Kennedy was also a concern because he was super young, playboy, and Catholic. A lot of people actually had concerns with the fact that he was Catholic because they were afraid the Pope would be running the nation, not John F. Kennedy. So it helps to choose a running mate that balances you and picks up for wherever you might be weak in the field. So, but it's a very hard role too, you know, the thought process of you having to step in at a moment's notice. For example, Lyndon Johnson, let me find this. A game? What the hell? Sorry, what the heck? That's terrible. People are awful. Okay, new share. So there are various images of JFK's assassination. They were in Dallas, they were visiting. He had not really been in office too god awful long when he was assassinated. You can see JFK here after he'd been shot. He actually was shot like here on the side and fell into Jackie Kennedy's lap. And this is her screaming. See, he's right here. I can't tell if it's here or if it's here. I think it's the one beside her. Yeah. And she's reaching for, this is a Secret Service agent, and she's trying to get him. She's freaking out, obviously. And there's a lot of things that happened during that. There's an image somewhere, I'm trying to find it, of her on the plane on the way back. Let me see. Lyndon Johnson. Here. So she's still in the same suit. You can't see it here, but like down on the lower part of her suit is like covered in her recently assassinated husband's blood. And because we can't have a gap of what's happening, who's in charge, what's going on, because that's a weak point for our enemies to take advantage. And that's sad, because you would think that people's humanity would kick in and they, wouldn't have to jump on the wagon that quickly, but they do. I mean, they were literally on the plane flying his body back to DC, and Johnson was being sworn in with a very distraught, fresh widow. Yes.
So it's the topic of this, but if there's a show called 11/22/63.
I've not heard of that.
And Stephen King wrote it, but
Okay.
basically the guy goes back in time to save John F. Kennedy and to talk to Oswald.
Wow.
So it's on Hulu. So
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds really interesting, because there are a lot of people who still like swear that Oswald didn't do it because a lot of stuff doesn't match up. So of course those are their conspiracies too. I mean, there are people who think Elvis is still alive somewhere out in Nevada. So maybe, I don't know. So I can't even fathom going through what she had to endure and then stand there watching somebody take over her husband's job right after he passed away. And it's just such a hard moment, in history. It's heartbreaking when you think about it. So, so that's something that, vice presidents have to be ready for. They have to be prepared to do that. Hello, come back. So, so those are the types of things that the vice president has to be ready to do. A lot of people don't think about it, but first lady is also something that's, or first gentleman, if we ever have a female president, that they have to step in as well, and do a lot of different roles that people don't really think about. This caption says that Kamala Harris served as a U.S. Senator from California and was the first woman and person of color ever elected to the vice presidency. She helped improve Biden's appeal with younger voters and non-white voters, and women. So we already discussed that, so we can skip over that. First spouse, they do a lot of ceremonial stuff. Say what? Say what? Kamala. A lot of times vice presidents are sent to do a lot of diplomacy stuff overseas, and I know that's what she's been doing. I don't know where she is right now, but so the first lady does a lot of like meet and greets, ribbon cuttings, that sort of thing. A lot of the handshaking sort of events, going and reading books at schools, and all of those sort of like touchy-feely types of things. But they can be active in policy conversations if they are so equipped to do so. And you see that a lot with people. I mean, like Hillary Clinton had more political experience than Bill Clinton when he was running for office. She had actually been in the game way longer than he had. And so they spoke quite a bit about political issues because she had the experience. So this breaks down who supports the president's agenda. It's the same that we've seen the whole class, right? Like the breakdown by the gender gap, by education, by income, by race. So I'm not going to beat that over the head. It's the same sort of stuff that we've discussed before. So Congress was really the main institution that you saw kind of running the show for quite a long time, but the presidency has continued to grow in power and expand its reach. And so the president definitely dominates a lot of policy making in a way that Congress used to focus on before. They have mobilized themselves and gone public. That all started with FDR. He did fireside chats where he went around the media and around Congress when he couldn't get things done. And he spoke directly to the people with a weekly like radio show where he would say what was happening and keep the public informed. And that sort of started what we see today. We see a lot of that now as well. Presidents were really not supposed to do that kind of thing. And FDR was like, flip the switch. He flipped the switch on everything, really. And I talk about that in the chapter 8 lecture that hopefully you guys will read. So Obama was the first person to make full use of the internet in a way that hadn't been done before. And we talked about that some with asking for small donations, really hitting social media hard during the campaign. And now it's insane to think about campaigns not utilizing that. So there's definitely still limitations, like, you know, public opinion's fickle, we change our minds all the time. Approval declines the longer a president's in office because we get tired of people, we have short attention spans. And then their performance rarely meets expectations. Everybody's always disappointed with the president. The buck stops with the president. They get beat up for everything, whether it's their fault or not. So approval ratings always dip the longer they're in office. If there's some sort of crisis happening, it's the president's fault, whether it is or not. And that just comes with the job, unfortunately. So we already talked about that. We talked about executive orders. Basically, it's legislation without having to go through Congress, just like that executive agreement was for treaties. Congress can overturn things. This is an interesting item to see. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit here. So these are all of the executive orders that presidents have done, starting with the most recent. So Trump did 51 executive orders in 4 years. And actually, I think the little asterisk is showing that that was at the time of the publishing. I don't think he was had left quite yet. Yeah, as of October of 2020. So
Actually, according to each paragraph shows the average number of executive orders each president issued per year in office.
Okay, gotcha. So you know, this shows how it worked. Now FDR was in for 3 terms, not a full 3rd term, but so he was in the longest. It would make sense that he would have the most, right? Especially during a world war. Yeah. And you see some, you know, like in the beginning, there were this is interesting, 0.25, didn't average out to 1 a year. So in the beginning, they were like, no, let's use that sparingly. And as our government grew larger, so did the executive orders. So it is what it is. So, and I already mentioned signing statements when a bill goes into law, so we don't have to do that. We've already talked about, say what? What, how many? They said on average, let me see what it says. Each bar in the graph shows the average number of executive orders each president issued per year in office. Now, that doesn't sound right though. Yeah, he didn't have this. Well, in the beginning, he had support from Congress, but I'm not sure if it stayed that way. I'm gonna have to look that up because I feel like that's worded wrong. It doesn't sound right. I'll look it up. So obviously the founders were worried about abuse of power, a king sort of situation. We talked about all of that. That's why we got the 4-year term limit. Congress can impeach and remove president from office. We already know that. Reject their appointments and treaties, deny funding to programs that they want to do, and override presidential vetoes. So that's the checks and balances thing we've been talking about all semester. And that's the end of that chapter, which took longer than I was hoping. So I'm gonna skip all of that. And real quick, let me go into, I wanna double check. I don't think that this is actually a big thing. It's been a while since I've looked at it. Let me open it. Oh yeah, that's not a lot. Not a lot at all. So, okay. Hold on just a sec. Let me get this started. Okay, that is already working. Perfect. Okay. So let me just go through real quick, see if there's anything you need to know. So bureaucracy is like the boring part of government, right? It's the tasks, the rules, the discipline that has to be done for basically making sure everything runs smoothly. That's kind of the gist of it. It's coordinating with all the different parts of government, so everything's a well-oiled machine and everybody gets things done. It implements the policies that Congress and the president pass. They can make rules that guide implementation of laws by Congress to make sure it makes sense, right? To like make sure it works in the real world. So examples of that: Environmental Protection Agency held Volkswagen accountable for emission levels. So they can make sure that people's feet are held to the fire. They're very mission driven. They're usually experts in those particular policy fields. There's definitely a clear line of authority. I mean, like, this is kind of your standard, like, this is common sense stuff. Think of how a business is laid out. It's very similar. I'm not going to read all of the 15 agencies. That's insane. NASA is considered to be an independent agency, which drives me nuts. I feel like it should be an arm of the government somehow, but it's not. And neither is the CIA, which is interesting. And some of that is so they don't get bogged down with the governmental red tape and can just do what they need to do. Post office is similar in that regard. Yep, see, government corporation is an agency that performs a market-oriented public service and raises revenues for its activities. Post office, stamps, right? That's how they raise revenue. So there are different types of groups within the whole bureaucracy thing. The gist is that they kind of keep everything rolling and moving. I'm trying to make sure there's nothing like super important that we need to like cover. Like Homeland Security, that is something we're all familiar with that term now, but that wasn't even in existence until after 9/11. So it focuses on border security, emergency preparedness, science-related concerns like biochemical things that can cause problems. Here are all of the executive branch departments that was just listed in the other area as well. And there's a lot of bureaucracy that has to happen to keep all of that running smoothly so we don't get bogged down, and it still happens. We already talked about cabinets, Treasury Department, that's common sense. They collect taxes, they manage the debt, they print money, and they deal with the economy. That's pretty basic, right? Other different groups focus on well-being. We've talked about the Drug Administration, the Food and Drug Administration before, right? Making sure that the safety of the way your food is handled is good. We actually discussed that at the beginning of the semester. CDC kind of falls under that. Medicaid and Medicare also are considered to be agencies that are for public welfare. Congress decides what agency focuses on what and what they're allotted to be able to do. President does have more control over that, but not a big deal. So this is interesting. Hopefully you guys took a look at this when you were reading the chapter. It shows basically what people feel about different agencies and whether or not they think they're doing a good job or if they're a waste of taxpayer dollars. And of course that's subjective, right? That's incredibly subjective. That's on page 379. You go down the line and you see like what people feel is effective. It's interesting that the post office has the highest approval rating. You think that would be not the case, but this is all like a civil service position, right? These are all government jobs to kind of keep everything going. So used to, we had what's known as the spoils system, where people were given jobs if they have political connections, until Cleveland had an assassination attempt on his life because somebody felt that they deserved to be given a position under the spoils system. And so when he had that assassination attempt, they got rid of that and said, okay, we just need to make sure people in these bureaucratic positions are actually qualified because we don't need to get shot over this. So So now it's the merit system, like the most qualified person gets the job. So we don't have that kind of issue again, like we did before. So that was the Civil Service Reform Act did that. So obviously you want the most qualified person, in any position really. So this shows you a breakdown of how bureaucracy is built itself. We have a lot more civilian employees now than military. There are a lot of contractors as opposed to service members. And there's a lot of, some people have issue with that because they feel like it's privatizing some things that we need like the government to focus on, but some people feel like it's better in the private sector, and it's all your feel on how you think government should operate, either by a larger means or smaller. So this shows you that we have had a steady decline in people in federal service positions, because a lot of it's going to contractors. So president appoints stuff, just like we were talking about in the last chapter. We've talked about oversight quite a bit already. I'll have to jump into that. That's not a big deal. Whistleblowers, we already kind of talked about that in another class. That's not something that we'll have time to go into a lot. Okay, and that's bureaucracy. So if we had more time, I would absolutely spend more time on it, because some of that is interesting, but it's really the driest chapter in the book, and a lot of it's kind of common sense and stuff we've already touched on in different ways when we talk about different groups and different levels of power. So I will wrap up everything next week. So make sure that you guys have finished reading the book, finish your project for sure, obviously, and get that submitted on time. If you have any questions about any assignments that you're missing, any questions about anything that you're still not understanding, please let me know. Yes. How do you guys feel about that? Would you rather have the extra credit go to this or expand? Okay, raise your hand if you want it to go to this exam. To the one that you just had. Raise your hand if you want it to go to the 5th exam for this is the museum thing. This is all the hands raised are people who haven't done it yet, or most. There are some who have already done it, but y'all are like, let's spread the love. So you thought about it, now you're, yeah, but you were work, yeah. Your word, yeah. She's trying to have your back. She's trying to have your back. Okay, so people are okay with moving the publishing museum out. So I will, the last exam, I'll just close it on the 14th. And then that gives you guys plenty of time over the next couple of weeks to get over there and do your thing and get it submitted. And then that way it'll be ready to line up with the 5th exam. How does that work? Awesome. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Oh yeah. Absolutely. All right, hold on just a second. Sydney, if you end up having any questions, feel free to email me.